and I will put that straight up onto YouTube. And then I will also cut it down into a more manageable thing. Before we get started also, please note that I will try to catch up on chat, but since I'm going to be teaching, I will have to pause and I have to look at chat and get caught up. If you have questions, I decided it might be good for you to go to Discord and put it into a channel called tutorial questions, specifically so they don't get lost in chat. You are more than welcome to ask the question in this chat, and I will absolutely try to get to it, but I will be doing teacher mode. Then I will switch and look at the channel and try to chat with you guys too. There's not gonna be any music in the background. Go get your notebook and pencil. This is gonna be recorded. Notebook and pencil. It's gonna be recorded, so you can look at it later, and we'll get started. So first of all, here's my introduction. I'm Mottzy, and welcome to my first Unity tutorial. Boom. Right? I don't really know how to do the hello, I'm Mottzy, and welcome to my first Unity tutorial. And I scratch my nose. That's one of the hardest parts for me about recording video, by the way, is that the introduction. So today we're going to be talking about how to get started in Unity. We're not talking about all the ins and outs of code exactly. We're more talking about when you look at Unity, what is it you need to know in order to learn things? So as a developer, I've spent 15 years in the development industry. I haven't been a game developer, but I have learned a lot about learning how to code and learning systems and learning frameworks. And so some of the things that I look at when I learn something really focus on what you need to understand so that you can then understand other things. So unlike other tutorials, this introduction is trying to cut to the chase of some of the key components of Unity. So when you look at a Unity project, when you watch a Unity tutorial, you'll have a better understanding of how it all fits together. I'm only going to be spending about 15 to 30 minutes, maybe 45, depending on questions tonight. So that means that I can only cover a very discrete amount of information. However, for my live stream people, the people that are watching right now, if you have questions tonight, I can go in any little level of depth as much as we need to. And if we're done, we can be done. So that's my little quick introduction. If you wanted to follow along, if you have Unity, I sure hope that you have it installed on your computer. I'm not going through the installation process. I am going to assume you have a project set up and at least running. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I will be glancing at it occasionally. Otherwise, I'm going to jump right into the tutorial. So we're going to switch to teacher mode. And you'll see at the bottom, this just tells you how you can get access to asking me questions, and I will check on that when I have a little pause between sections, and then we'll go from there. So first of all, just to get started, let me make sure everything looks good here. Okay. So while I have a project open in the background, right there, I wanted to quickly talk about the type of project I created. So when you go into Unity, you get Unity Hub, which is really what you need in order to have a proper new version of the software and, you know, do your installs and so on. When you create a new project, you have a bunch of options. For tonight, for this tutorial, I am using a 3D project, just a baseline 3D project. It has very minimal stuff in it. There are other options you can use. You can do a 2D project as well. What I'm about to talk about is relevant to 2D, except it's in a 3D space. Be right back. Have to see some tutorials for Maya. Go get your tutorials. Okay, so here is our Unity window. When you start out a brand new project, this is generally what you should see. When you look at another project, you might see a whole lot more stuff. This is actually a pretty simple view, and we're going to talk a little bit about the pieces of this window and what's important for you to focus on. And I have my notes here, so just so you guys know, I have to reference my notes so I can look at it and then talk about those each piece. I will try to run through this pretty quickly. If I'm going too fast, please let me know. I'm happy to back up or restate something, especially if I didn't say it right, or if you think that there might be a better way for me to explain it for you. So first of all, just getting oriented on how the Unity window system works. It's meant to be very modular. You can basically move any of these pieces around to suit your needs. There's a lot of tools and applications out here like this. This is just like some of those. Any of these windows, these tabs can be moved around. So if I wanted the project tab to be up here, or if I want to be down here, if I wanted to get rid of any of these, I can close those individual tabs if they're in my way. It's basically meant for you to suit it towards the needs that you have for your development process. If at any time you feel like you messed up your layout, you can always go to the window menu and you go to your layouts, and then you can choose whatever layout you want. For instance, I have a Mottzy layout. This is what I use for whatever reason. It feels comfortable for me. And then there's also the default layout, which is what you usually get when you first start a project. So you can always mess around with that. If something doesn't make sense, doesn't feel right, you can move it around. You can move it to somewhere that makes sense. Down here at the bottom left, this is super important for everyone to know. This is your project window. So your project window, your project tab, if you will, this is where all the files that make up your project live. So if you went into a file system, if you found these in the file system, which you can go to right click and go to show and explore, you can see that the file system matches what you see in here, assets and packages. There's a couple other things that get stored, but primarily it's the assets and packages folder that you see in Unity. So that's all you really need to know is assets is like the main folder. So anytime someone talks about adding something to your project, usually it goes into your assets folder. Next, we have the hierarchy, top left here. The hierarchy is what was that I was supposed to take that thing out of my ear. The hierarchy, hold on. The hierarchy is where your active scene lives. So your active scene is what you see here in this window. You can see here the scene tab. That window here represents basically the game space that you're editing. And you can see in here it already has what's called a sample scene. So a scene essentially is a collection of stuff that gets used for any portion of the game. It's a whole collection of a scene, like a level or a stage. You know, those are other words that you might think of when you think of scene. And inside the scene are all the different objects that you might need to manipulate. On the right-hand side, this one right here, the inspector will show you information about anything that you have selected within your project. So if I click on, for instance, this sample scene, you can see right here it doesn't really have anything. It just has the sample scene. But if I have other objects here, I would see more information. So if I click on the camera, I have all sorts of information about a camera. If I click on directional light, I have all sorts of information about the directional light. So Inspector is a great place to go to find out more detail or configure more detail about the things that you're clicking on. Usually in the hierarchy is where you have things you can change, and down here in the assets, it's something that you can look at but not necessarily configure. The scene consists of something called game objects. So the thing about Unity is it's a framework that tries to make it easier for you to conceptualize pieces of your game. And a game object is just the highest level thing that makes up a game. It's an object of your game. It can basically be anything. And in fact, in a scene, everything is a game object. Even your camera is a game object. So this, to me, was really important to understand, because as a developer who works in frameworks all the time, it's really important to understand how the framework thinks about the objects that it works with in whatever space it's working in. In game development in Unity, the main unit, the atomic unit, if you will, the main parent unit of everything is a game object. And by default, you get a game object that has a camera. And by default, you get a scene that has a camera and a directional light. Each of these game objects, if you look on the right-hand side, if you look on the right hand side here, each of these game objects have a bunch of what we call components. And the default component for every game object is a transform. Transform is just where it sits in 3D space. So you can see immediately when I click on the camera, I get these little handles and this lets me move around. I understand for some of you that may have experience with 3D tools, this stuff is elementary. That's what I'm going to try and just brush by it. But this is important to understand that when you look at transform, when you look at camera, when you look at audio listener, all of those things are components. Transform is a component that you cannot remove. It's a component that is built into every game object, even ones that don't do anything within your scene, and they're just game objects. And they just sit there and you have script or you have something else that they do. They still have a transform. The special object, of course, is the camera. The camera happens to be something that you need in a scene in order to show something to the user. So imagine just like you had a studio with a real camera, like I have my camera here looking at me. That camera is what you use to point at things within the scene. And there's some things you can do programmatically with it. We're not covering the programmatic part of that. I'll actually save that for some future little vignette tutorials. But it's important to know that that camera is what's looking at the things that you will see when you play a game. And of course, camera has a bunch of different settings and other options for it. Hey, Akai, welcome back. And of course, you can't see anything in a scene without lighting. Lighting is another concept for 3D development, 3D art, that you just need to point a light at something in order to illuminate it. In the 2D world, I don't think you might have lighting. I actually don't know how 2D works. But you definitely will have some sort of camera, right? You need to have some way to point, I think. Actually, I'm not speaking from knowledge there. Let me just say that when you work in the space of 2D, you actually have some similar elements and concepts, but they might be slightly different because you're not working with, all 3 dimensions. You just check my notes here. Feel free if you do have questions, or again, if I'm going too slow or or going too fast, feel free to let me know. Okay, so we went over the inspector, we went over the project. Oh, let's talk about the project settings. Okay, let's talk about project settings because this is another important piece. As you're learning Unity, you say, okay, I got these objects, fine, and I have all this stuff down here that I'm messing with, which I'll show you some other things we can create down here. But what if someone tells me I need to configure something about my gravity, or about my inputs, or any other things related to a project? This is a really important thing to look at, which is if you look at your your edit menu, there is a project settings option. So this is a pretty important thing to know about. This has many different settings, and if you're looking at tutorials, sometimes they will reference the project settings. And in fact, when I'm working with project settings, I actually move it into a tab, so then I can quickly get access to things like the input manager or physics configurations, which are really important. 3D needs physics, so you got to use that configuration information. So just something to know about. Again, this is about learning to learn and knowing some things to focus on that are important, because there are a lot of options. And in a little later in this tutorial, I'll actually open a project that has a lot of information in it, and I'll show you how you go about finding your way to getting some information to find answers. Okay, so we talked about the scene game. I clicked on the asset store briefly. Someone actually mentioned or asked a question about the asset store. So here's what I'll say about the asset store. There's a lot of people selling a lot of stuff about Unity, and a lot of the stuff says, here's this great way to solve all your problems. And that's where you go for the asset store. There are some really good things in there. I highly recommend looking at it and researching it and seeing if the thing that you want does what you want it to do. But I would suggest if you're just learning, probably stay away from the asset store. It's much better to go to a YouTube tutorial and read some tutorials online, or go to learn.unity.com, I think, or is it learn? Here we go. Learn. Yeah. learn.unity.com, because that's the greatest place to get started with all the specifics on basically anything you need to do within Unity. There's also YouTube personalities like Brackeys. Even though he doesn't do anything anymore, he still has plenty of videos out there. Start there before you think about getting anything from the asset store. That's just my humble opinion. There may be people who think differently, but I happen to feel like it gets really complicated, and I looked at the asset store as this is going to solve all my problems, and all it did was make me feel more overwhelmed. And most of the assets have much more work involved to configure and use them than you think they're going to. Oribu, going back to project settings, if you go to the edit menu, you go down to project settings. So edit menu, project settings. I happen to open it into a tab. If I close the tab, it'll go away. Edit, project settings, and then you can see all sorts of different options. And this can also be overwhelming. What I would tell you from the project setting options is that you don't have to mess with a lot of this stuff. If you're using the current version of the Unity input system, which is now kind of an old version, you want to go to the input manager. If you're working with physics information, like what the base gravity is of the world, which is something that does come up, you want to go into the physics settings. Pretty much anything else here you can kind of mess with, but to be honest, when you're getting started, I wouldn't get too heavy into what project settings do, other than to be aware that they are there. We'll move that back over there. We'll get off the asset store, and I'll go back to my my settings. By the way, I will post this link here in the chat, learn.unity.com. That is still a good place to start as well. This is kind of a crash course on just what are all the things that you're looking at. Now, outside of the asset store, which is, in my opinion, something to avoid in the beginning, you can go to the package manager. So a framework and any coding system has, well, any good coding system or any ubiquitous normal coding system, C#, Java, even C++ probably has a package manager. Hey, Drastic Action, welcome. A package manager helps you pull in new things that help you kind of get some of your projects done, your code done. Some of the packages are purely code-based and you have to use them in code. Some of them let you do some things that eliminate the need to use code. I need to like have my hands showing. So the package manager is important to know. And if you ever hear someone say, oh, you need blah, blah, blah thing, and you're like, well, that thing's not in my project, then you go to the package manager. And I need to find out where it is because I forgot. Oh yeah, it's in the, okay. So the package manager is in the window menu. So you have a window, package manager. Again, you could put the package manager just as a tab here. I don't go to it enough for it to matter. So I usually don't keep that visible to me, but I'm also a fairly new Unity dev, so maybe I'll figure out a new layout some point in the future. The package manager has all this stuff, and this stuff is useful, and some of it is overwhelming. And as a new person, you may or may not need any of this. But what I will tell you is this. I guarantee you, you will watch a tutorial where someone is using something that you don't have in your system. And they might reference it. They might say the word Cinemachine, which is a very useful package to have. So you can go to the package manager and say, oh, they're using Cinemachine in this, so I need to get Cinemachine. And there you go. You can install a version of Cinemachine so you can follow along with the tutorial. Cinemachine is basically just a set of tools that make managing the camera better. And again, I'll do a little tutorial on that sometime in the future, because I've actually just recently used it. So I'll probably show it tonight, honestly, for my Makerville work. I'll show you what I did with the Cinemachine, but that won't be part of the tutorial. That'll be me just showing you. Another one that I found useful is input system. Input system is the new way that Unity has created for managing controller input, keyboard input, and so on. it does take a little bit more work. And from what I've seen from the tutorials out there, I've had to piece together information. So as a new person, don't worry about it unless you find a really good tutorial. Just know it's there, and know that I will very soon, in the next week or two, do a little vignette tutorial on that as well, because I find it to be much better to use than the old input system. And Jurassic, if you're just stopping in and you didn't see my tweets, this is a teaching session for Unity and sort of my jump start into it based upon what I learned in the first game jam I ever entered. So I've just learned Unity, and I think that learning and then teaching is actually a really good way to teach yourself more. So just know the package manager exists. Google it, look at Unity Package Manager, look at Unity Common Packages. There's a lot of awesome stuff out there. There's something called Pro Builder that makes building 3D scenes easier. I haven't tried it, but it's really interesting. So that's just a good thing to know about. It's good to know that there is this thing that lets you pull in new stuff, and you don't have to go download something from a website and install it. You can just go to the package manager, search it, and then install it that way. There's also other places that you can pull it from, so you could still get something from the internet. But, you know, in my opinion, usually it's best to start with what's ubiquitous, what's installed with the built-in registry, rather than going somewhere external. And see, so 9:37. So I'll probably go with this for until about 9:45 or 10, depending on how, you know, any questions I have or anything like that. All right, so let's talk about the scene. Now that we've kind of had a quick sort of spin around the universe here, we've learned what a project is. We've learned, what the inspector does. Let's see it all in action. So when you start, you have nothing here. You have a camera and you have a light. I can move the camera around, and when you go to mess with the camera, you can see there's a little camera preview that basically gives you the option to see, what it's pointing at, but there's nothing there. So one thing that you're going to do a lot in Unity is right-click to create game objects. So you can see here, if I right-click on the scene, or if I right-click even on one of the objects here, I can add a game object of any type. I can create an empty object, which does nothing in it. I can create a 3D object, which is of different types here. I can do even 2D objects and effects. So I'm not going to go into each one of the things that you could do, but if you know what a game object is, and you know what kind of game objects you can add, you can Google some of this stuff, because Google is a good tool for people learning things, and find out a little bit more about how it works. For our purposes, we'll start by adding what's called a plane, which is just a flat surface. I add the plane, a flat surface, assuming that I wanted to make a stage or something for a player to play on. And let's say I want to make it bigger. So up here are all the tools that you can use for modifying your 3D object. You have the movement tool, which is the little arrows. You have a rotate tool, which is this circular thing, which has different ways of rotating. You have a resize tool, and you have a box tool, which is kind of a different way to resize based on these little nubs at the end. And you also have a move, rotate, or scale tool, which is like everything in one. So it's just, why do these 4 when you can just do this 1 and solve all your problems? So for the plane, I want to make it a little bigger, so I'll go to the resize tool. Now, these with 3D tools, this is a very common methodology. So if you ever use Blender, or if you do voxel work like I do, voxel tools have these sort of nubs and angles and things. This is just how you manipulate things in 3D space. So the nubs on the edge, those represent an axis you can move on. The nub in the middle is what you can use to drag it all at once. Other tools like Blender, they actually have an extra little nub for doing this type of effect, but Unity's a little bit more simple. But if I wanted to stretch it in one direction or the next, I can just pick it by the angle. Now this vertical one, which is the y-axis, doesn't do anything because it's a plane. It's supposed to be flat. But I'll show you in a second a different object that you can actually manipulate. So, okay, I got a plane, great. Here's my scene. That's not very exciting. Let's add something else to this. So why don't we just add a cube? Very common and standard thing we might want to add. One thing you may, so the use of the 3D space, the actual key inputs and controls, I highly recommend you look up keyboard shortcuts and mouse movement and so on. I will verbally tell you how it works with the mouse, but this is something that if you don't have experience with 3D tools, you just may want to look it up. It's not actually very hard, but if you're not used to it, it might take a little bit to get used to. So first of all, you may notice I just did this quick little drag here. This is the middle mouse button that I'm using to basically just grab and translate the 3D space so I can kind of move things around. If I want to rotate, I use the right mouse. And it gives me this little look. If I want to select something, I use the left mouse. This gives me a little common select button that you would see. So there are also key equivalents. I don't know what the keyboard equivalents are off the top of my head, but I do tend to use the middle mouse button a lot. I zoom in and zoom out with the mouse scroll wheel. This is just basic usage. We've got the cube. I'm going to go back to the move tool just so I can get it, somewhere where I want to make it stand on top of here. Right now in this editor, there's no physics involved. There are ways, this is down the road, more advanced, there are ways to make the editor behave with physics, either by playing your game or using editor extensions. Don't worry about that for now. Just know for the moment you would have to kind of move and drag. All right, so we got two objects on the screen. Both of them have components on the right-hand side. And all of these objects that are 3D, they come with some stuff built into them. They have something called a render, like a mesh renderer and a collider. These are the things that are responsible for actually rendering the cube, the mesh renderer. The mesh is just the 3D definition. The how would you say it? The mesh is like the skin. The mesh is like the skin of the object, and that can be treated in different ways. You put a texture on a mesh, or it can have a solid color, but that's really what is responsible for representing the structure of the object. A collider, that gets used a lot in the physics engine. It also gets used a lot when it comes to code. So a collider just says that something can run into this, and either it's going to actually be a physical collision, it won't, things can't go through it, or it could be a trigger and it will cause something to happen. That's, again, for the future, how to use colliders and triggers and all that stuff. That's for future tutorials. But knowing that's what that is important, because a lot of the tutorials you watch will tell you to use a collider, or it'll show you the use of collider. And so this isn't really magic words. It's just basically saying, here is a definition of a box that the player can't go through, or that reacts to physics, or so on and so forth. And as I said earlier, these are all components. You can add and remove them. I can remove a component with this little vertical hamburger menu. I don't know what you call that. I can move it around. I can even copy it and paste it to other places by doing copy component. And then if I click on another one, I could do paste component as new. There's lots of things that you could do here. Again, all this stuff is something to play with, and when you start doing code, it'll be even more important to know that colliders get used a lot, and so do mesh colliders and other things like that. I showed you the tools over here on the left that are used to manipulate this object, but if you're a person that's more analytical, a person who likes to structure things more precisely, you can see here in the transform component, all of these values represent where it sits in 3D space. So if I want to change the rotation, I can literally change this by a number, right? I can just add one number. I can add 100 or whatever. I can change it directly and not use a tool that feels imprecise. I can also use any of these values like a little slider, which I honestly think this is super important to know about, because sometimes you want to change it precisely, but without having to like type in the numbers, right? You're still using your mouse. You can also, let's see. No, I thought I was trying to figure out if there was a way to manipulate all the values at once. I don't think there is. There might be, but I don't know. But there is some importance to the fact that you can click on these. I'm fairly certain that you can copy and paste values between these, but I'm not going to say that for 100% because I think it hasn't always worked for me. But suffice it to say, this is where you manipulate these values more directly. So you can mess with the scale. You can change it from here, as opposed to going to these tools on the left-hand side. Just double check if there's any questions. Don't see any questions. We talked about a box. We talked about manipulating. Here's one other thing is you might end up playing around with these and end up with a scene that's quite large. One of these keyboard combinations lets me copy and paste. How do we do this? Maybe not. You might end up in a situation where you have just a bunch of objects around here. I'm just using copy and paste right now, and you can see as I do that, it just makes a copy of the game object. And you may want to be able to zoom in on one of these objects. I find that sometimes you just get kind of out of whack. You're way back here for some reason. Somehow you navigated around. There's two ways that you can actually get kind of back on track. One is you can double click on the object on the left-hand side. So double clicking on any of these basically brings it to focus. The other is that if you can get a click on it, I can click on it from there. You can also press the F key, which means focus, and gives you the focus of the object. I think as a beginner, someone who's navigating 3D space, that's super useful if you want to get close so you can manipulate the object. And you may be somewhere kind of out of whack. Usually this becomes a problem when your scene is much bigger and you have a lot more objects on the left-hand side. Something I didn't show earlier, but any of these objects can be parents. So what it means is just like a file system, you can drag objects under other objects. This has very important meaning when it comes to working with your project. I found that when you had things like animations, and again, animations are important. We're not talking about it today, but when you do have animations that are in place, like a box that moves up and down, which is just a simple animation, if you put it inside a parent object, you can copy and paste it and move it around, and it'll put its position relative to the parent. So when I have a cube under here, this cube now, its position is relative to that parent cube. So you see how I move the parent and they all move with me. So that's really valuable and really important to know. You don't just put things under there to kind of group them. You also give it a way that you can manage all of them at once. You can move a big group of things all at once. And it also has some implications to things like animations and code and so on. So I'm not sure how many people talk about the parent relationship here, but I think that that's an important thing for people to know. We talked about tools, we talked about components, talked about the collider and the mesh, the 3D objects that have mesh. One thing I want to say about collider though, when we talk about the object, like the definition, the mesh that makes up the object, that's different from the box that represents collision. And the best way for me to demonstrate this with the cube is a little harder because there's not a lot of vertices to look at. So let's make a capsule. It's like a little pill. See, the capsule has a green outline around it. If I go to the capsule collider and the collider, there's a way to edit just the collider. You'll see that there is this green box. That's green, not box, this green wireframe. This is actually the collider. This is what tells Unity how collision works. So if I make it this big around this capsule and you had a player that would interact with colliders, it wouldn't be able to even get close to the capsule because this green box is actually what represents the collision area for that capsule. So that's super important to know when you're learning the code and people talk about colliders. Colliders have their own little wireframe that you have to work with. and it's somewhat annoying to work with sometimes, because if you look at the capsule versus the collider, they're not always aligned. It depends on how you set it up, depends on how you added the collider. These are simple objects, but more complex objects or players, you have to align them differently. And so knowing that you could edit just that collider itself. Sorry, there we go. Knowing that you can edit it on its own is pretty important, because this will be something when you start working with games and collisions that you'll want to know how to manipulate and move around on the screen. Okay, talking about colliders, and we're actually getting close to the end. So the final thing I want to talk about, this is where let me get rid of this thing. This is where my biggest epiphany came from. I'm a developer by trade. I'm used to working with code. I know how to code in C#, but I didn't understand how Unity kind of meshed with code. I kind of envisioned what I see in web application development, really complicated frameworks, and you've got to know all this stuff about how things fit together. And I'm just going to say it's really not that hard. In Unity, they make it stupid simple. And sure, once you know the simple, it gets more complex, but it really isn't as hard as I originally thought it would be. So first, I want to point out something about this assets folder. Most times when you look at a project, this will be, full of different folders. But some common folders that you are going to see, almost just, without fail, you're going to see a folder called scripts. You're going to see a folder. You're going to see a folder called scripts, and in that folder there's going to be some code. Sometimes they call it code, sometimes they'll call it source. Scripts is a very common term, and that's what you create. You create C# scripts that do things for you in the context of Unity. You're also going to see a folder called prefabs. This may be in a subfolder somewhere. Oftentimes people have an art folder, and then an art folder they have prefabs. It could be in many different places. Ideally, they only have one, but people set up their projects however they want. But prefabs are very important, and we will talk about that near the end here. So I said there you might have an art folder, and a lot of times the art folder has things like your actual physical assets, like if you're importing a 3D model, or you have textures or so on. The organization of it doesn't matter as much as the fact that it's there. You'll have animations and other things. There's a bunch of other things that you'll see, and I'll open up a project and I'll show some of them. But the scripts one is really important because that's where all the code goes. And there's a couple ways that you can create scripts. One, the simplest way, if you know what you're going to do, you can just go to create and you can create a C# script. That's fine, right? It's called a behavior. Behaviors are just sort of actions on objects. So it's sort of behavior-driven development. And in this case, I'll just call it a test controller. The name of it doesn't matter. You can call your object anything you want. Controller is a very common term, especially if it's controlling a character or so on. But it can basically be anything. And you can see here when I click on it, as I said earlier, it tells you kind of what's in it, right? So this actually shows me the script, the code. To edit these scripts, I didn't prepare people for this, but to edit these scripts, you need some kind of editor. So VS Code is a very common thing, or Visual Studio. I use a tool called Writer, which is a JetBrains tool. It does cost money, but I find it fits my style better because I've been doing web development in that tool set for 15 years. So that's one way, though, that you can create a script. When you have the script, you'll have to edit it at some point, but at least you know it exists. If you're using some existing assets, there'll be scripts that you might have to use. And if you're looking at an object and you see a component like this that says script, it means it's a script in the project. One thing that you can do to get access to that script, if in a component here, if you see a script, you can click on the name and it'll highlight it in the package browser, or the assets section. As you can see, what I did to add components was really simple. I just dragged it onto here. So most of the objects can do that. There's a lot of opportunities to take a thing and drag it, and it becomes part of whatever object is in the scene hierarchy. So I selected cube, and I just dragged the script there. Another way that you can add a script is by clicking on add component. You can see there's all sorts of components you can add, but I can go to script, and then I can actually say, I'll just start typing like my cube script. And you can see this is trying to search for something called my cube script, but it doesn't exist. So I can actually tell it to create a new script like I did there, and I can just create and add it. So when I create and add it, it's going to add it somewhere in my project. So I'll click on here, and you see it just kind of added it somewhere random. Not my favorite, but you can always move it. And then you now have, two scripts. You can have many, many scripts attached. You can have scripts that add different behaviors, and it's sort of like a mix and match. So a lot of these assets you get from the asset store, they have a ton of scripts, and you plop the script in and you do stuff. But this is where it gets interesting. So as a developer, I would look at Unity and I'd say, man, this is so complicated. How does this work? How am I going to write code? How is this going to, there's so many different questions. But a lot of what Unity does for you is provide some base functionality that makes it super stupid simple, but it makes it super simple to do sort of customizations and magic of code without having to know a ton about programming. You don't have to have massive, if you know programming, object-oriented, hierarchies. You can just have a script, and the script can just do the one thing you want, and you can drag it around and use it in other places. So for example, we'll go into my cube script. Now I'll open this up in my IDE. It'll take a second here. And I'll expand it out just so we can see everything. So this writer is not that far off from VS Code. It has some different conventions and standards, but just like any editor, it does a lot of the same things of any script editor. 1 second. So it does a lot of things of any script editor. But it's geared in a slightly different way than Microsoft's VS Code does. So if any of this stuff doesn't make sense, just know that the main focus here is the code that you look at. You guys might see the little, the flames. This is a plugin I added to Writer called Power Mode, I think, or something like that. And it just makes it look cool when you type. That doesn't exist for default tools, but you can get it. If you guys know who Wallaber is, Wallaber, where is he at? There he is. Wallaber makes a game called Pro Gymnast, and I asked him about this tool because he has something in VS called it's called Power Mode for VS Code, and Power Mode does basically that. And I just thought it was cool, so I decided to use it. So it's just fun to see the text and do all that stuff. This is totally tangential to me actually teaching. You're mostly lurking. Thanks, Wallaber. In fact, I'll send a shout out to Wallaber. If you guys don't know, Wallaber not only made Pro Gymnast, but he made a game called Jelly Car and a game called Where's My Water. Lead designer on those things. He's really cool. You should definitely check out his stream when you get a chance. So here's our script. And there's a couple of things about script. If you don't know coding, very basic things that you should know. At the top here, all this using nonsense, this is just basically saying, here's all these packages I want to use. So earlier I said there's a package manager in Unity. Well, this is kind of like me saying, okay, of all the packages I have, here's the specific package I need to use. Oftentimes, you will not have to remember anything about what goes up there. Either your IDE will suggest one for you, or the tutorial you're watching is going to say, add a using statement and do that thing, right? So for the beginner, the uninitiated, the new programmer, what this means, God, that's kind of distracting. For the uninitiated new programmer, what this means is just a sort of definition of what's available to the script. As you can see here, we have the script name, and it has something called mono behavior as its type of class. Mono behavior is the base class that's used for all of Unity objects. We'll pause for a second. Where's my water? Like the one with the crocodile trying to shower? Yes, that's the one. I entertained my daughter for hours with that game. Okay, so we get into the script. You can see that when you create a script in Unity, you have some baseline, what are called methods that are created. So these methods are things that get hooked into the system automatically. The start method is when the object is, it's after the object is created and when the object is starting up. I don't know exactly where in the life cycle of the object creation this actually occurs, but I know that there are two main start methods. There's one called awake and one called start. So if I have void awake, bam, whoa, this is crazy. Is that text distracting anybody, or is that good? Do you like it? Tell me in the comments, because I don't know. So awake and start, I fucking love it. Okay, so awake and start are important. If you don't want to worry about awake, it's fine. A lot of the tutorials you see will tell you to use one or the other, but they both effectively do the same thing. It's basically when the object's created and you want to start stuff up. It's where you initialize things. So if you have some objects you're working with, you want to manipulate or use, that's where you do start. Update happens on a cycle within the Unity application, which is update actually happens in a non-normal time. It's basically, it kind of goes with the performance of the system. So if your system is lagging, update kind of goes with the lag. It's not a consistent, like every whatever. There's also something called fixed update, which happens on exactly a concrete, consistent time. So a lot of times you want to do update for most of the things that you're going to do. And update is just something that's like, okay, this is happening in a certain time frame, which is, milliseconds of time. And if I want to do something that's repetitive, like I want to have a blinking light or a person who's kind of dancing, or I want to check for input, I put it into the update method. So those are important, but to be honest, you'll learn what methods are available. There's all sorts of different things that you can use here. I'm going to use a little IDE trick where I can do generate Unity event functions. So this is, IDEs have these kind of tools built in. I use, I don't know what it is in Unity, but for Writer, I use the Alt and Enter keys. And then I can pick the event that I want to use. And you can see there's a ton of things that you can hook into. You can hook into, these different update functions. On enable, it's when the object becomes enabled, or if it gets disabled. Destroy is when the object gets removed. So if you change scenes or you remove it from the scene, on destroy happens before it disappears. So there's a lot of different things that you can override. And you should look at these things. You should Google it. You should look up what events are available and learn about how they work. But for the purposes of this, all you really need to know is there's a lot of options. And when you're taking a tutorial, someone's going to say, oh, on collider overlap or something, right? And you're like, oh, is that some magic? No, it's not magic. It's built in. So just know that what Unity tries to do is give you a lot of things for free. And those things are really useful. And oftentimes all you have to do is say, oh, I saw it in a tutorial, or I saw it on some code. Let me look it up. Let me go look at mono behavior, and that will answer my question. But what I thought was the most cool, this is like the Mottzy kind of aha moment, the Mottzy moment. I like alliteration. So my Mottzy moment was when I was watching this awesome tutorial by a guy named James Plus Games. I was learning how to do a 2D platformer. And I saw him go, oh, well, then we got to do public, float, speed. Okay. Now, as a refresher, if you're not completely familiar with code, these are called properties or fields. Unfortunately for me, coming from a more Java background, they kind of call it the same thing, but in C#, they have properties and they have fields. Because a field is usually something that's only, I gave you guys the middle finger there. A field is something that's usually only available within the class. It means that if I name a private or a protected, it's saying that when I'm writing my code, The only way I can get access to this is if I'm writing the code inside of this area. And everything burns down, apparently. But public, things that are public are things that you can get and set their properties if you treat them a certain way. So C# is a little different, but whatever it is, what gets defined at the top here, which is where we usually put these things, they define things, variables that we can access or use within our code. Public, float, speed. So let's say I have a character and I want to have some kind of velocity. C# uses floats for all of that. So a float is just anything with a point, something, something. And I want to be able to configure that. I want to say I'll add one character and I want the speed to be 5, and another character I want the speed to be 10, right? This was my major moment where I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I just made that change in my code. You guys can't even see my hand. I don't know why I'm moving my hand so much. You guys can't see any of it. I just made the change in my code. I'm going to go back to Unity and I'm going to go look at the object I added the script to. And you can see right there, bam! This is okay. So this is what got me really excited about Unity, folks, is this particular thing. I can define properties in my code, and Unity is smart enough to pick up on that code and say, oh, you have this thing that you want to configure. Let me put it up here for you to edit. This is extremely powerful, folks. It means that as a person that's developing, if I'm just writing code and I'm working with somebody like I did for my Game Jam project, who isn't as much of a coder, I can make the configuration for them to use. So if you're ever pairing up with a developer, maybe you're not quite familiar with Unity, but you're good with art, or you're kind of good with scene development, you could have the developer give you these properties that you can set. And if you're a developer, you can make those properties so they're configurable. And the best part about this is whatever I put here for this script, if I go to another object and I add that script to it, I can have a different value. So you see this a lot. And to me, this is one of the keystone pieces. This is so important as a developer. This is so important as someone learning Unity to understand that when you're looking at these scripts people write for you, when you're taking assets other people gave you, or you're writing your own assets, and you see all this stuff like, well, how the heck did they get all this configurable? When I saw this at first, I was like, what the heck? How are they making this happen? Are they having to write all this UI code? Then I learned how it works. I'm like, oh, that's all it is. That's simple. And it is. It's incredibly simple. And you should think about it as incredibly simple because coding itself is not hard. Logic takes some time, but coding itself is not hard as long as you know the right places to put your words, like writing. And this is a super important thing that's part of your code. So if I put public float speed here, and down in the update, I want to do something with that speed, like I can do, and this is one thing I was going to show from a code perspective. This is a good thing to know, debug.log. Let's say I just want to access the value of speed. I can put this here, and I'll do toString. For those who don't know C#, C# is ostensibly it's a strongly typed language, but it's sort of a, there's another word for it. Basically, it's strongly typed, but it kind of allows you to get away with mixed typing because the compiler is so good, it can infer what you're trying to do. But because speed is a float and debug.log requires me to give it a string, I have to convert speed to a string. If you don't know what any of that means, just Google it. It's really not that hard. But just know that that's a pretty common thing that you'll see in this kind of code. So I can say debug log toString. Now this is going to happen a lot of times when I run my code, but I'm still going to show you. So if I go back to my project, this is a project I created. I put speed here as 10. I put speed here as 5. There's one piece I didn't show anybody, and it's called the console. It's called the console. I also didn't show you the game. So let me back up for just a second and talk about the game window. It's actually one that I skipped. The game window is when you're running your game, what you see. You can see there's nothing there right now. And that's because my camera is not pointing at anything. So just so we can actually see what's going on, we're going to move the camera. See right there? So we get the cubes in view. They're not going to do anything. We're not writing interactive code yet. That's for the future. And I'll show you Makerville tonight so you can take a look at that. But you can see here what you'll see when you go to the game. So if I go back and forth here, the game's not running, but it does give me a preview of what I'm going to see when the game is running. So when I run this, there's this thing called a console. The console is output for the game. It'll show things like errors that happen if something's broken, or debug.log console statements. And you might say, well, what's this magic debug.log? Well, this is a what's called a static reference. There's a class called debug built into the framework. Other coding frameworks, maybe you have to use a different type of method, but Unity wants to make it easy, so you use this what's called a static reference. It's, hey, Unity engine, here's a debug class you have. Perfect, I'll just use that, right? So debug log will put things into the console. So a lot of times what you'll see people do when they're teaching you code is they'll say, okay, let's get this project working, folks. Let's do hello world. And so if I were doing that, I would say, let's say hello world here. Right? This is the equivalent of doing a hello world test. I made a script, I took a value, I'm going to output it. So when I hit play, you're going to see the console get loaded with stuff. It won't even stop, right? Because these are happening in this update method. And so you can even see like it's just constantly running. It's gonna, it's 999 plus, right? I'm filling up my log with all these statements, and I'm getting 5 and 10. So I'm getting the debug statements from both cubes that I added my script to. Now, what's interesting about this is another learning thing that I thought was super cool. Like, okay, well, I have this cube, but I don't really want this one to work right now. So I'm just going to disable it. This little checkbox, I can actually disable functionality from here, and it's super useful for someone who's learning and testing things. So now if I run it again, and for clarity, I'm going to clear this. If I run this again, I should only see 5, and I only see 5. Now, here's another thing you should know about the way Unity treats your game. You can actually see your editing view while you're playing a game. You can actually mess with these values and see what happens if you change it. So if I go back to the cube here while the game is running and I change this to 10, you should start seeing 10 show up, or 15, right? Unity's highly interactive, so it lets you as a developer work with your game kind of real time and live, so you kind of test things and mess with things. I can even turn this off if I don't want to see those values, and you can see that it stopped outputting. Or I can turn it back on, or I can go back to here and I can turn this back on. So lots of really interesting things. You notice I can't mess with the values here, but I could go back here and I can pick this object and I can move these objects up and go back to the game, and you see they moved up. Or what I do in my view is I actually have the game window in a different place. So I can see the game and I can see the edit view, and I can actually move the game around while it's running. It doesn't make a lot of sense because nothing here is interactive right now. There's nothing moving. But if this were a live running game and I had like moving objects, you would see them in both places moving. So there's a lot of power behind how you can work with your Unity game and mess around with it. I'm going to do a quick check to see if there were any questions. I don't think there were. There are not. So we're almost done. The final couple things I'm going to cover is I'm going to look at prefabs, and then I'm going to look at a real example of a couple of projects just to talk through some of the components of it. So you may have heard this term called prefab, which when I heard the term prefab, it sounds really fancy and complicated and confusing, and like, oh, I have to like do some crazy rendering and fabricate something. I don't know. The word sounded really confusing to me. And then I found out a prefab is just kind of like a stored version of a game object that you can reuse. So what I'll say here is if I have like my test cube, this is a game object with all this different configuration, and we have our subcube here and we have our scripts associated with it. Let's say I want to reuse this in many different places. If I have more scenes, right? So I have one scene here, but let's say I make a brand new scene and I want to bring that stuff over with me. Well, there's a couple ways that you can do it. First of all, the less ideal way, if you want something that's reusable, is I can go in here and I can create a scene. We'll call this scene 2. I can hold on, cancel. I can copy this object. I can just do Control C, copy it. I can go to scene 2, save what I have, and then I can paste it in here. Voila, I have all my objects. But there's a problem. If I go back to scene 1, let's say I wanted to say these are, you know, equivalent. These things operate the exact same way on both scenes. If I go back to scene 1, I turn one thing off. I go back to scene 2. That thing that I turned off is still turned on. It didn't turn off, right? So the way you make it work, the way that you kind of reuse functionality is by prefabs. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to go back to scene 1, save. Remember to save, folks. And instead, I'm going to drag this object straight down to my prefabs. And so it just does it. It moves my object down to my prefabs folder, and this is the collection of that object. So now you can see it becomes blue. It indicates that that is a prefab, and it's some kind of reusable code. And if I go back to my second scene, scene 2, I can drag that object up into my window, and now I have a copy of whatever it was I configured in the other window. So you see here, the script is turned off because that's part of the prefab. But now here's the interesting part. When you have a prefab, you can actually change values that don't get shared. So I could have something that, okay, it's a prefab, but I want to save, you know, I want it to be turned on here and not over there. That's fine. And you can see here, if I go back to the other scene, so I'll save it. If I go back to here, you can see it's still turned off. But let's say I decided that this is actually the representative set. I want all of my prefabs to make use of this. I can actually go here. So this is where at this inspector menu has a new thing, right? Prefab open, select, or overwrites. So I can either say, oh, you know what? I don't like what I set. I want to go back to whatever the original object was. I can revert. Or I can apply. Applying will take these changes and push them down to the prefab. So now the prefab is, this is the representative set of the prefab. So if I go back to scene 1 and go back to my test cube, it automatically updated that prefab that I was working with. So this is super duper important. Now, I will say that I'm not an expert on prefabs, but I understand conceptually how this fits together. I presume that if I've overridden something, so if I've decided that doesn't get checked, it won't automatically pick up the changes and I'd have to go and revert it. But if I haven't changed anything about the object, so I have like 10 different objects on many different levels, and I want one to be the one thing, I can apply that and all the objects will be updated. So as a developer, as you're coming up with ways to reuse your functionality, this is a really useful thing to do. Oftentimes you'll find it with camera settings, or they have something called a game manager. So a game manager is just kind of a set of settings like scores and other functionality. So it's useful to have these prefabs and have that reusable functionality and have a way to push those changes to many different places. The reason I'm calling this out specifically on how you apply it is some of the tutorials you will see out there are old. Unity has updated over time. They've got new versions, and the newer versions use this method. Older versions have a slightly different method. So it's important to know this is where you do it. There's also another thing you can do when you're messing with prefabs is you can focus in specifically on the prefab. And so this says prefab open. You can specifically open the objects in that prefab, so you can mess with their settings, and then you can save it. So that's also another important thing to know. But that's what prefabs are, and that's how you use them. All right, so I'm almost done. I've gone through a majority of all the things. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I will open up the out of control, and I'll talk through my really bad code. Well, I'm not going to talk through it. I'm just going to show it briefly and kind of talk through how it fits with all of this project stuff. It's really weird, by the way, to wait for questions when there's no one talking. So I'm going to open up Out of Control. Out of Control is the project that I built with my friend Drasray for a 2-week game jam. This is what I learned. So I went from not knowing anything about Unity, other than it looks confusing, to making a game out of it. And everything I taught tonight is really based upon what I found was important as I learned how to use Unity. So let's get this going. So this is Out of Control. there's a lot of stuff on the left-hand side. And the sample project I had very few things. Some of this stuff you don't even need to worry about. But you can see here, as I said, there's things like scenes, which are all the levels. There's scripts, one big nasty folder of scripts, in fact. There's things like materials, which wood and so on, which represents the textures that are getting used for these platforms that you see here, out here. There's models. So models represent like the characters, the fox, and so on. So when you're looking at a project for the first time, this is a great place to start. Start on the project section and see how they organize it and see what's there and kind of get a feel for what is available. Then, of course, you'll always want to find the scenes and then see what kind of scenes are available, right? So we have this is the first level that we created for this game. Drasray did all the art assets. I did all the code. And he kind of set everything up in the scene, and I just sort of got it all wired together. But, you know, there's a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of stuff to look at, and there's a lot of stuff to understand. So knowing how to use the middle mouse button to scroll, knowing how to click on an object and use the F key so you can zoom in, all those things are super important. As far as what I'm actually teaching you here or showing you is just kind of giving you an overall view of what it looks like to look at a big project or a bigger project. You can see there's tons of objects on the left-hand side. And I didn't cover this earlier, but if you think you know what you're looking for, you can also search. So if you want to just find the camera, you can put a little search in there. A lot of the boxes that you see in here have little search boxes that you can look around with. So all in all, this is just a sample project. You can see I have scripts, I have components, I have controllers, a lot of pieces that fit together. If I were to look at a project like this when I first started, I would have probably lost my mind. But knowing that you can go from the project here to the scene to finding an object like player, and then understanding that when you click on it, there's going to be these components and transforms and scripts. Those are all really useful. You can also, by the way, if you see a script in a Unity project and you want to know more about it, you can right click on it and go edit script. And then this will take you into whatever IDE of choice that you have. So this is the Fox controller script, and this is a lot of code. So I'm not going to talk through all the code, but you can at least start by looking and saying, oh, so these are some of the settings that we'll have and we'll use. And here's, you know, on enable. Oh, that's probably when the object gets created. And oh, start. Well, I honestly didn't know the difference between these two when I created this code. But lots of different options. And so when you're looking at the code for the first time, at least you'll have some general understanding of where it fits together. Finally, the only other thing I want to show you, because I don't want to show my project as the only thing, is Unity has a thing called 3D Game Kit. I think that's what it's called. That is something that you can get from the asset store. I will be honest, I tried to take that and then rebuild my Makerville project using that 3D Game Kit, and it was a dismal failure. And that's because the style that they were using with the code and what I was trying to do, it didn't quite mesh up. And this is why I say, even as a very experienced programmer, trying to take what someone else wrote and rebuild it so that it fits my need is extremely difficult. So sometimes as a beginner developer, it might be better to just start from the beginning, following a tutorial, writing code from scratch, than it would be to, you know, try to learn specifically how this developer configured their code and how you should configure your code to use it. This is a really big and complicated project. You can see here, there's scripts and prefabs, there's, you know, animations. So this is the type of project that when I looked at code, I would just, I couldn't understand it. And my brain would just break. I'm like, well, but how do I do this one special little thing that I want to do when I have like 20 things I have to learn? So as I said, this tutorial session is really about learning how to learn. You may or may not benefit from looking at a big project like this and trying to learn it. I highly, highly recommend you find tutorials, learn.unity.com, Games Plus James, Brackeys on YouTube. All those things are great places to get started, and follow some tutorials that tell you how to do some of the basics, especially the ones that take you from the beginning to a fully end product. But, if you ever want to look at an existing project, at least you know now, here's where the scene information is going to be. I would infer this Ellen is the actual character. Look at all those lines, right? This is the type of thing that would really confuse the heck out of me. Anyhow, there we go. That's it for teacher mode, Mottzy. So in this tutorial, we covered all the basics of understanding how code fits together in the system. In this tutorial, we covered all the basics on how the system fits together, and you need the assets, the hierarchy, the inspector, and how to find your way around the system. In future tutorials, I'll actually talk about code. I will talk about platforming and animations and camera rigging. All these things you can find tutorials on. I will leave some links in the descriptions of my I'll leave some links in the descriptions of my YouTube videos. However, I'll try to come up with little interesting tidbits that are quick and easy to learn. So future tutorials, I will keep them very short. I'm crushing your camera. I will keep them very short and really targeted on learning, a bite of information. Once you know how everything is aligned here, though, it becomes a lot easier to figure out how to learn the next level and the next thing you need to learn in Unity. So thank you all for watching this tutorial. I will see you all next time, or I will see you all next after I switch back to my stream view. I was trying to do that for in my YouTube videos, I go, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. So I'll probably try and just steal that bite. All right, folks, let's get back to business. Brass tacks. Woof. That tutorial